The rain fell in heavy, rhythmic sheets, turning the sole pavement into a blurred mirror of neon lights and shattered dreams. Min-Jun stood motionless, the freezing water soaking through his threadbare jacket until it felt like a lead weight against his chest. In front of him, the engine of a sleek black luxury sedan purred, a car that, until this morning, had been his. Min-Jun, move. You're blocking the way. Shin-Era's voice cut through the storm, cold and devoid of the warmth that had once promised him forever. She stood by the passenger door, her designer trench coat pristine, looking at him not as a husband, but as an obstacle to be cleared. Era, please, Min-Jun rasped, his voice cracking under the weight of the downpour. This is my car. Everything I've left is in there. We said we would fight together, that we would rebuild what was stolen. Era let out a sharp, mocking laugh that was drowned out by a clap of thunder. Fight? We've been trying for 3 years, Min-Jun. And look at you. You're a fallen king standing in the mud. She stepped closer, her eyes flashing with a cruel pragmatism. I'm taking the car as compensation for every second of my life I wasted believing your lies about tomorrow being better. But I have a meeting today, he pleaded, reaching out a hand that she recoiled from as if he were a leper. A lead on a job. Things are finally going to change. Forget it, she snapped, turning her back on him to enter the vehicle. As the door opened, a man leaned over from the driver's seat. It was Hwang Jae-wook, Min-Jun's former lieutenant, the man who had orchestrated the coup that stripped Min-Jun of his title and his wealth. Jae-wook didn't offer a word of apology. He simply adjusted his expensive silk tie and offered Era a confident, possessive smile. Don't worry, Jose Daniel, or whatever you're calling yourself now, Jae-wook called out over the rain, his voice dripping with condescension. I'll take much better care of her, in the business, than you ever did. Min-Jun watched in stunned silence as his car, pulled away, splashing muddy water over his shoes. He was left with nothing but the clothes on his back and the bitter taste of a double betrayal. The woman he loved and the friend he trusted had vanished into the gray mist, leaving him a ghost in his own city. As he stood there, shivering and broken, his hand drifted to his pocket, fingers brushing against a damp, crumpled piece of paper, a lottery ticket he'd bought with his last few cents, a final, desperate prayer to a god he wasn't sure was listening. Min-Jun walked with heavy, waterlogged steps until the neon glow of a corner convenience store offered a sanctuary from the biting wind. His pride was already a jagged ruin, but the gnawing emptiness in his stomach forced him through the sliding glass doors. Inside, the air was warm and smelled of overbrewed coffee and floor wax. He moved toward the refrigerated aisle, his eyes settling on a simple bottle of water and a pre-packaged rice ball, the cheapest fuel he could find to keep his body from collapsing. He approached the counter, where a young clerk with tired eyes and a name tag that read Hannah was organizing cigarette packs. Min-Jun reached into his pocket, his fingers searching for the small roll of bills he usually kept there, only to feel nothing but damp fabric. A cold realization washed over him. Era had not just taken the car. She had taken his dignity and his last cent. That will be $3.50, sir, the clerk said, her voice neutral but expectant. Min-Jun placed his hand on the counter, his knuckles white. I seem to have misplaced my wallet. It was in the car. Before the clerk could respond, a man standing in line behind him let out a loud, derisive snort. Look at this guy, dressed like a common beggar and trying to pull a fast one over $3, the stranger mocked, his voice carrying through the quiet store. If you can't pay, get out and stop wasting everyone's time. Min-Jun felt the heat of shame rise to his neck, a sensation more painful than the freezing rain outside. He was a man who had once commanded rooms with a whisper, now being publicly dismantled over the price of a snack. I'm sorry, Min-Jun whispered to the clerk, his head bowed. I didn't mean to. I just had a very bad day. Hannah looked at his trembling hands and the way the rainwater pooled around his feet. She let out a soft sigh, her expression softening with a flicker of empathy. Forget it, she said quietly, sliding the items toward him. It's on the house today. We all have days like this. Min-Jun looked up, struck by the unexpected kindness. He couldn't just take it, not after being treated like a ghost for so long. He reached into his breast pocket and pulled out the damp, crumpled lottery ticket. "I can't take this for free," he said, his voice regaining a sliver of its former steadiness. "Please take this. It's a winner. I can feel it. If it pays out, consider my payment, and a tip for your kindness." The man behind him laughed again, a sharp, ugly sound. "A lottery ticket? That's the oldest trick in the book, kid. Don't let the beggar fool you." Min-Jun ignored the man, keeping his eyes locked on Hannah's. He pushed the ticket across the counter with the solemnity of a blood oath. "I promise, if this wins the jackpot, I'll give you half," he said, his words a quiet vow against the storm. Hannah hesitated, then slowly reached out and tucked the ticket under the register. As Min-Jun stepped back out into the rain, he didn't feel like a beggar anymore. He felt like a man who had just placed his final bet. The gnawing in Min-Jun's stomach was nothing compared to the hollow ache in his chest as he navigated the slick, narrow backstreets toward the Golden Heights district. He had clung to a single shred of hope. An old contact had promised him a private interview at a high-end lounge, a chance to manage a legitimate security firm. It was the tomorrow he had promised Era, the job that would finally pull him out of the mud. He reached the frosted glass doors of the lounge, his damp clothes marking him as an intruder in a world of marble and gold. As he stepped inside, the heat hit him, carrying the scent of expensive cigars and aged whiskey. He scanned the room for his contact, but his heart stopped when he saw two familiar figures seated in a velvet booth at the center of the room. Hwang Jae-wook sat with his arm draped possessively over the back of the booth, a crystal glass of scotch in his hand. Tucked against his side was Shin Era, her head tilted back in a light, melodic laugh that Min-Jun hadn't heard in years. There was no job interview. There was no old contact. The entire invitation had been a tether, pulling him here to witness his own replacement. "Ah, the guest of honor has arrived," Jae-wook called out, his voice booming with a confidence that felt like a physical blow. He didn't stand. He simply gestured to the empty space in front of the table. "You're late, Min-Jun. But then again, you've been falling behind for a long time now." Min-Jun stood frozen, the water from his jacket dripping onto the plush carpet. "Era? What is this?" She didn't look away this time. She leaned further into Jae-wook's embrace, her eyes scanning Min-Jun's disheveled appearance with a mixture of pity and distaste. "It's over, Min-Jun. I told you this morning, but I suppose you needed to see it to believe it. Jae-wook didn't just take your place in the organization. He took your place here, too. You arranged the interview." Min-Jun realized, his voice a low, dangerous rumble. "You wanted me to come here. I wanted you to stop dreaming," Jae-wook interjected, taking a slow sip of his drink. "I wanted you to see that while you were busy trying to rebuild a ruin, I was already living in the palace. There is no job, Min-Jun, who would hire a man who couldn't even keep his own wife or his own men." The lounge fell silent as the socialites at neighboring tables began to whisper and point. Min-Jun felt the walls closing in, the crushing weight of a betrayal that had been planned for months, perhaps years, under his very nose. He looked at the woman he had spent 3 years protecting, and the man he had once called brother, and saw only strangers. "I didn't come here to make a scene," Min-Jun said, his voice regaining a terrifying, quiet clarity. He straightened his shoulders, the broken beggar from the convenience store vanishing as the cold iron of the MAFIA boss returned to his gaze. "Thank you for showing me exactly who you both are. I won't interfere with your happiness." He turned on his heel and walked back out into the storm, leaving their laughter behind. As the freezing rain hit his face, he reached into his pocket and felt the empty space where the ticket had been. The world thought he had lost everything, but for the first time in years, he finally saw the truth. He wasn't just a fallen king. He was a man with nothing left to lose and a debt of blood and gold that was about to be paid in full. The morning light was a pale, sickly gray as it filtered through the window of the derelict apartment Min-Jun had retreated to, a stark contrast to the neon-drenched nightmare of the previous night. He sat on the floor, his damp clothes finally dry but stiff with salt and grime, staring at his empty hands. The fire that had sparked in the alleyway was now a cold, hard knot in his gut. He was calculating his next move, a ghost planning a haunting, when a frantic pounding at his door shattered the silence. Min-Jun didn't move at first, his old instincts flaring. He expected Jae-wook's debt collectors, or perhaps the police, but the voice that came through the wood was high-pitched and breathless. "Mister, please, are you in there? It's Hannah, from a store." He rose slowly, his joints protesting, and pulled the heavy bolt back. Standing in the hallway was the young clerk, her face flushed and her eyes wide with a mixture of terror and disbelief. She was still in her uniform, a thin windbreaker thrown over her shoulders, and she was clutching a smartphone so tightly her knuckles were white. "You have to see this," she gasped, stepping into the room before he could speak. She thrust the phone toward him. On the screen was the official lottery results page, the winning numbers glowing in bold, undeniable gold. Min-Jun looked at the screen, then back to the girl. His expression didn't change, but the air in the room seemed to grow heavy. "Why are you here, Hannah?" "The ticket," she whispered, her voice trembling. "The one you gave me last night. I scanned it before I left my shift. I thought it was just a kind gesture from a man who had a bad day. But I scanned it, and the machine started screaming." She scrolled down the page to the prize breakdown. The jackpot sat at the top, a staggering figure followed by so many zeros it felt like a hallucination. "It's the grand prize, sir. 100 billion won. It's millions of dollars." Min-Jun took the phone from her, his fingers steady. He remembered the moment he had pushed that crumpled paper across the counter, a silent vow made in the face of public shame. He had told her it was a winner, but seeing the cold, digital proof felt like the first time he had breathed in years. "The man in the shop," Hannah continued, tears welling in her eyes. "He called you a beggar. He said I was being fooled, but you weren't lying." She looked at him with a sudden, sharp realization of the power he now held. "You said if it won, you'd give me half. You said you were a man of your word." "I am," Min-Jun said, his voice a low, resonant hum that filled the small space. He handed the phone back to her, his gaze shifting to the window, looking out toward the skyline where the Golden Heights Tower stood. "But we cannot claim it yet, not while they are still watching." He turned back to her, and for the first time, a small, dangerous smile touched his lips. It wasn't the smile of a lucky man. It was the smile of a king who had just found his sword. "Keep that ticket safe, Hannah. Don't tell a soul. The world still thinks I'm a broken man. And for a little while longer, I need them to keep believing that lie. The humiliation, the betrayal, the rain, it was all a prelude." As he looked at the young woman who had shown him the only mercy he'd known in years, he knew the game had finally shifted. He wasn't just surviving anymore. He was preparing to reclaim his throne. The transition from a broken man to a calculating architect of his own resurrection began in a cramped, dimly lit office on the edge of the legal district. Min-Jun stood before a door that bore a tarnished brass plate. Baek Dong-hyun, attorney at law. He pushed it open, the scent of old paper and stale coffee greeting him like a familiar ghost from his past life. Behind a desk overflowing with case files sat a man whose sharp eyes had seen the rise and fall of empires, yet remained unchanged. Baek Dong-hyun looked up, his expression shifting from professional exhaustion to stunned recognition. He didn't offer a platitude or a pitying glance. He simply stood and closed the blinds, sealing them into a world where only the truth existed. "They said you were finished, Min-Jun," the lawyer stated, his voice a low, gravelly hum. "They said you were wandering the streets like a shadow." "A shadow is exactly what I need to be for a little while longer," Min-Jun replied, taking a seat in the worn leather chair. He leaned forward, the cold weight of the winning jackpot, a fortune that could reclaim everything Jae-wook had stolen, settling between them like a hidden blade. "I have a means to return, Dong-hyun, but if I move now, Arrow will take half of every sin I've earned before I can even strike back." The lawyer nodded slowly, his mind already spinning through the intricate web of marital laws and asset protection. He understood the stakes. In 15 years of practice, he had seen many men lose their fortunes to betrayal, but he had never seen a man with the discipline to stay silent while holding the keys to a kingdom. "You need a clean break," Dong-hyun whispered. "A divorce by mutual agreement, with no financial claims. We must make them believe you are truly desperate, so desperate that you're willing to walk away with nothing just to end the humiliation. I want her to sign a document that forfeits all future claims to my income, Min-Jun said, his gaze hard and clinical. I'll give her the house. I'll give her the last of the cars. I will play the part of the defeated husband one last time. Dong-hyun began pulling fresh documents from his drawer, his pen scratching against the paper with a rhythmic, predatory intent. They spent the next hour mapping out a quiet divorce, a strategic retreat designed to lure Era and Jae-wook into a false sense of absolute victory. Min-Jun would appear at the signing as the man they saw in the rain, broken, penniless, and eager to disappear. Once she signs this, Min-Jun, she can never touch a single one of that jackpot, the lawyer confirmed, sliding the petition across the desk. But you have to stay in character. One slip, one look of confidence, and they'll suspect you're hiding something. Min-Jun looked at the papers, the ink still wet. He thought of the $3.50 humiliation and the laughter in the lounge, and he felt a terrifying, silent peace wash over him. Don't worry, counselor, Min-Jun said, his voice as cold as the storm he had emerged from. I've practiced being a ghost. Now, I'm going to show them how much a ghost can truly take back. Min-Jun walked into the glass-walled office of the city's most expensive law firm, his shoulders slumped and his gaze fixed on the floor. He wore the same salt-stained jacket from the night of the storm, a deliberate uniform of defeat. Across the mahogany table, Shin Era sat beside Hwang Jae-wook, who leaned back with the bored arrogance of a man who had already won. The air was thick with their silent judgment, a heavy pressure that Min-Jun met with a rehearsed, trembling sigh. I didn't think you'd actually show up, Era said, her voice sharp and impatient as she tapped a manicured fingernail against the table. I thought you'd be too busy wandering the streets, looking for your lost pride. Min-Jun didn't look up, his voice barely a whisper. I just want this to be over, Era. I can't keep fighting you, and I can't keep fighting him. You were right. I have nothing left to give. Jae-wook let out a short, dry chuckle and slid a thick stack of papers across the polished surface. Then signed the petition. It's a mutual agreement. You walk away with your skin, and Era keeps the house and the last of the properties. No financial claims, no alimony, no legal drama. Just a clean break from a man who is clearly going nowhere. Min-Jun reached for the pen, his hand shaking with a precision that only Baek Dong-hyun would recognize as calculated. He looked at the clause he and his lawyer had meticulously vetted, the one that stated all future income and assets earned after this date would be the sole property of the individual. To Era, it was a standard formality to protect her from his debts. To Min-Jun, it was the iron gate that would lock her out of his new empire. Are you sure about this, Min-Jun? Era asked, a flicker of something, perhaps a final, dying spark of guilt, crossing her face. Once you sign this, you can't come back later saying you want a piece of what I have. I'm absolutely certain, Min-Jun replied, his voice flat and hollow. He pressed the pen to the paper, the ink flowing smoothly as he signed his name for the last time as a failed husband. Take the house. Take the car. Take everything you think has value. It's my way of paying for all the time you wasted with a man like me. Jae-wook snatched the papers the moment the pen lifted, a predatory grin spreading across his face. Smartest thing you've done in 3 years, Min-Jun. Now get out. You're staining the carpet. Min-Jun stood up slowly, his movements heavy and deliberate. He looked at them one last time. The woman who had traded her soul for a predator's shadow and the man who thought he had stolen a kingdom. He didn't feel anger, only a cold, clinical detachment. The trap was set, and they had walked into it with smiles on their faces. As he turned toward the door, leaving behind the only life he had known, he felt the weight of the winning ticket in his mind, glowing brighter than any neon sign in the city. The separation was legal, the fortune was protected, and the beggar was about to become the hunter. Min-Jun stepped out of the high-rise office and into the crisp, biting air of the afternoon, his heart beating with a cold, rhythmic precision. Behind him, the heavy glass doors clicked shut, sealing away the echoes of Era's condescending pity and Jae-wook's triumphant laughter. He walked half a block before a nondescript silver sedan pulled up to the curb. The door opened, and Min-Jun slid into the back seat, where Baek Dong-hyun sat waiting with a thin, leather-bound folder. The lawyer didn't speak at first. He simply handed Min-Jun a single page, the stamped and witnessed copy of the final divorce settlement. Min-Jun's eyes skipped past the division of their meager debts and the transfer of the house until they landed on the specific clause they had fought to bury in legalese. "It's done," Dong-hyun said, his voice a low, steady anchor. The moment she signed that document, she legally severed any claim to your future. Under the terms of this mutual agreement, any income, assets, or windfalls acquired from this second forward are yours and yours alone. By ceding the house and the car, you've essentially paid her to walk away from a fortune she doesn't even know exists. Min-Jun traced the ink of Era's signature with his thumb. To her, this paper was a victory, a way to discard a broken man while keeping the last of his pride. To him, it was a shield. And if she tries to come back? If she claims I hid the ticket during the marriage? She can't, Dong-hyun replied firmly. In 15 years of practice, I've never seen a man leave everything to his wife so willingly, and that generosity is exactly what protects you. You didn't hide the ticket. You gave it away as a debt of honor to a stranger before the ink was even dry on the petition. Legally, you are a ghost who just inherited a kingdom, and she's a stranger who has no key to the gate. A strange, quiet peace settled over Min-Jun. The humiliation of the $3.50 breakfast and the stinging rain felt like memories from a different lifetime. He looked out the window at the city skyline, the glass towers gleaming like jagged teeth. For 3 years, he had been a man trying to survive, a man defined by what he had lost. "So," Dong-hyun said, leaning back as the car pulled into traffic. "What do we do now?" Min-Jun folded the paper carefully and tucked it into his jacket. The beggar was gone, replaced by the cold, calculating architect of a new empire. "Now," Min-Jun whispered, his voice as sharp as a razor, "we go get paid. It's time to show them exactly how much a man with nothing can truly take back." Min-Jun stood in the center of a private, high-end tailor's atelier, a space of hushed luxury that felt worlds away from the rain-slicked alleys he had haunted just days prior. The transformation began not with clothes, but with a cold, clinical shedding of his past. He watched in the mirror as a stylist trimmed away the ragged, salt-crusted hair that had symbolized his 3 years of trying. As the locks fell to the floor, so did the last traces of the broken man who had been humiliated over a $3.50 breakfast. When he stepped into the custom-tailored charcoal suit, the fabric felt like armor. It was a sharp, Italian-cut silhouette that emphasized the predatory stillness he had reclaimed. He adjusted the silk tie with the same rhythmic precision he had once used to command his organization, his movements no longer burdened by the slump of a beggar. He was no longer a ghost wandering the streets. He was a man who had inherited a kingdom. "You look like a man who has never known a day of want," Baek Dong-hyun remarked, leaning against a mahogany wardrobe as he watched the final adjustments. Min-Jun caught his own reflection. The eyes staring back were hard and focused, devoid of the sentimentality that had allowed Era and Jawook to strip him of his pride. He checked the weight of his new watch, a subtle but unmistakable marker of the massive jackpot that now sat protected behind a wall of legal iron. He was quite content to start his life over, but he knew that for justice to be served, the transformation had to be absolute. He reached into the pocket of his new jacket, but instead of a crumpled lottery ticket, he felt the cool, smooth edge of a black titanium card. The physical change was merely the outward manifestation of the unstoppable force he had become. He had risked everything and, in doing so, had truly won everything. "Is everything ready for the board meeting?" Min-Jun asked, his voice a low, resonant hum that brooked no argument. "The mysterious investor has been announced," the lawyer replied with a thin, sharp smile. "They're expecting a savior, but they have no idea it's the man they left in the mud." Min-Jun nodded, his gaze fixed on the door. He was ready to return to the world of gold and lies, but this time, he wasn't looking for love or loyalty. He was a man of his word, and he had a debt of poetic justice to collect. As he stepped out of the atelier and into a waiting luxury sedan, the rain began to fall again. But this time, he was the one behind the glass, looking out at a city that was about to realize its king had never truly left. The atmosphere inside the gold-painted corporate boardroom was thick with the scent of expensive cologne and desperate, unspoken anxiety. Hwang Jae-wook sat at the head of the table. His fingers drummed a frantic, uneven rhythm against the polished mahogany. Across from him, Shin-era adjusted her pearls, her eyes darting toward the double doors with every footstep that echoed in the hallway. The business they had stolen was hemorrhaging value, and today, a mysterious, wealthy investor was scheduled to finalize a comprehensive business transfer, the only thing standing between them and total bankruptcy. "Where is he?" Jae-wook snapped, checking his watch for the third time in 10 minutes. "This agreement encompasses everything, the trademark, the inventory, the lease. If he doesn't sign, we lose it all." "Relax," Era whispered, though her own voice trembled. "The lawyer said he's a man of his word. He's already transferred the first 5,000 into the holding account." The doors swung open with a heavy, deliberate force. Baek Dong-hyun stepped in first, his expression a mask of professional stone as he laid the formal petition and transfer documents on the table. Behind him walked a man who seemed to command the very air in the room. He was draped in a charcoal Italian suit that fit like a second skin, his posture radiating a quiet, predatory dominance that made Jae-wook instinctively sit upright. Jae-wook stood, extending a hand. "Welcome, sir. I'm glad you've arrived to give us a bit of friendly advice on the transition." The investor didn't take the hand. He moved to the window, looking out at the city he had once ruled. "Friendly advice is for those who work for their money, Mr. Hwang," the man said, his voice a low, resonant hum that caused Era's breath to hitch. "I'm here strictly for the legal formalization of the separation." He turned around slowly, and the air left the room. Era gasped, her hand flying to her mouth as she recognized the hard, focused eyes of the man she had abandoned in the mud. "Min-Jun," she whispered, her voice a fragile sliver of disbelief. "Chang Min-Jun is dead," he replied, his gaze sliding over her as if she were a ghost. He was a man who believed in fighting together for dreams. "I am simply the client who purchased your debt." Jae-wook's face paled to a sickly gray. "This is a joke. Where did you get the money? You didn't even have 50 cents in your pocket when you signed the divorce. That doesn't matter now, does it?" Min-Jun said, leaning over the table to sign the final transfer agreement with a steady, clinical hand. "Starting from this very day, the full legal ownership of the entire business officially belongs to me." He straightened his suit, looking at the two people who had bet on his failure. "You took my car and my house because you thought I was a broken man," he said, his voice dropping to a terrifyingly calm whisper. "But you forgot that some people become rich, and then there are those who become great. You can leave immediately." The silence in the boardroom was absolute, broken only by the sharp, rhythmic sound of Min-Jun clicking his designer pen. Era stood frozen, her eyes darting from the legal transfer documents to the man who now radiated a power she had never truly understood. The beggar she had abandoned in the rain was gone, replaced by a king whose presence commanded the very air she breathed. "Min-Jun, I didn't know," Era stammered, stepping toward him with a practiced, trembling softness. She reached out, her fingers hovering near the sleeve of his charcoal suit, seeking the familiarity of the man who had once fought for her dreams. "Everything with Jae-wook, it was a mistake. I was scared. I thought we had nothing left, and I just wanted us to be safe." Min-Jun didn't flinch. He didn't even turn to meet her gaze. He looked past her, his eyes fixed on the city skyline where his new empire was already taking root. "You didn't wait, Era," he said, his voice a low, resonant hum that carried no trace of the old pain. "You saw a man at his lowest and decided he wasn't worth the time. You didn't believe in the lion. You only believed in the scrap he could provide." "I can make it up to you," she whispered, a desperate tear tracking through her makeup. "We can start over. This restaurant, this business, we can run it together like we always planned." A faint, dangerous smile touched Min-Jun's lips as he finally looked at her, not with anger, but with a terrifying, clinical detachment. "I've already found someone who knows the value of a promise when there is nothing in the bank," he replied, thinking of the clerk who had held his winning ticket. "She didn't need me to be a king to show me mercy. You, however, only recognize the crown." Jae-wook sat slumped in his chair, a broken shell of the man who had boasted of his dominance only an hour before. Min-Jun gestured toward the door, where his security detail now stood waiting. "The legal formalization is complete," Min-Jun stated, his tone as cold and final as the snap of a briefcase. "You're no longer partners, owners, or even guests in this building. You can leave immediately." As Era was escorted out, her pleas dissolving into the sterile hallway, Min-Jun felt the last of the salt-stained shadows vanish from his heart. He was no longer a ghost haunting his own life. He was an unstoppable force, a man of his word who had turned a $3.50 humiliation into a legacy of justice. He adjusted his cuffs, looked at the lawyer who had stood by him, and walked toward the elevator. The storm had passed, and the king was finally truly free.